From the bowels of the Balkans emerged a man who managed to keep alive the longing of many southern Slavs to unify within a single nation. He was a character who stood up to Stalin, Hitler, and Churchill and came out victorious to tell about it. Self-made war hero and father of Yugoslav socialism. A nationalistic and pragmatic socialism that for 35 years governed the diverse mosaic that formed the Republic of Yugoslavia. A union that brought together the peoples of Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and others. A pragmatic man with the Anglo-Saxons and disloyal to the Soviet Kremlin, the first communist president to confront Stalin in his lifetime. He led with a diplomatic glove in one hand and a rifle in the other, a period of unparalleled stability and economic and social growth in the Republic of Yugoslavia, while managing to neutralize the serious internal rivalries of the region. Marshal Tito and his experiment of socialist self-management became a reference for non-aligned countries seeking a different course to either capitalist vassalage or Soviet vassalage. However, of his experiment today, there is no more trace than a mixture of forgetfulness, indifference, rejection, and the so-called Yugo-nostalgia, a feeling of longing that some experience for the old Yugoslavia and its way of life. Today we will discuss an unprecedented political case. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I remind you that you can give us great support to continue doing this work simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below, you can also find a link to the Patreon, where any collaboration is more than welcome. Without further ado, let's get started. Josip Broz was born on May 7, 1892, in the Croatian village of Komrovec. He was the son of the Croatian Franjo Broz and the Slovenian Maria Haversek. It was a peasant family with 7 children, and Tito spoke Slovenian and Serbo-Croatian from a young age. Serbo-Croatian is the common language spoken in Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and parts of Kosovo, being a unifying factor for these communities. By that time, Croatia was part of Hungary, which at the same time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vigorous empire formalized in 1867 and which extended to what we now know as Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and part of other European countries. Many of these peoples who were part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy were made up of the so-called South Slavs. As is the case of these peoples in the 19th century, a romanticism was emerging nationalist that sought to unify all the South Slavs within a new national body of their own was the case of Croatian, Slovenian, and Serbian groups that many centuries ago came to be unified under a single nation before the Ottoman invasions. However, since then they had become fragmented. Yugoslavia precisely means land of the South Slavs, although it should not be overlooked that just as some Slavs supported this unification, others were rather very suspicious of their neighbors. Tito was raised by his maternal grandparents in a rural area. He was a young man who was absent with rural where he lived. He was a young man who frequently missed classes, and his schooling did not last more than 4 years. Also forced to work due to the precariousness that the family was living, he dedicated himself to working on the family farms, and sometime later he got a couple of jobs as a machinery supervisor where he would spend more time distracted reading books than supervising the machinery. Shortly after, he travels to Zagreb, which is the current capital of Croatia, and there in 1910, at the age of 18, he joins the Metal Workers Union, from where he begins to participate in his first protests and strikes and to familiarize himself with this political and union world. In the following years, Tito wanders through the most important cities of the region in different jobs in the metallurgical area, from Slovenia to the current Czech Republic, passing through Munich and the beautiful Vienna in Austria. But the truth is, the presses and the machinery. His preferred environment was the presses and the machinery. His preferred environment was the conversations in the gym, and when he wasn't whispering, he would practice fencing or dance. However, this restless life is disrupted when at the age of 21 in 1913, he is drafted by the Austro-Hungarian monarchy to serve 2 years in the army in a regiment in Zagreb, facing the war that was about to break out. During the winter of 1913 to 1914, he trains as a skier and was commissioned in Budapest, becoming the youngest sergeant major in his regiment. In the army, he never stops practicing fencing, a discipline that takes him out of the theaters of operations and makes him the army champion in that area. By July of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy declares war against the Kingdom of Serbia, which serves as a pretext for the series of military responses that became what we know today as the First World War to fight on the Serbian front. And then at the beginning of 1915, he is sent to the Russian front to fight. During that period, he would learn valuable lessons about maintaining troop morale. That same year, his front is attacked by Russians and Cossacks. Tito is wounded and imprisoned and spends 13 months in a monastery that had been transformed into a prison and a hospital. There he would learn Russian, losing sight of the fact that part of the agitation in Europe had been coming from a long time ago, also pushed by the proliferation and confrontation of various ideologies that sought to explain the world. Liberalism, socialism, conservatism, communism, nationalism, anarchism, and much more. The southern Slavic peoples, like the rest of Europe, became part of these disputes. From this debate of ideas held over a pool of blood, the revolution against the Tsar of Russia ends up being unleashed in 1917, a perfect occasion for Tito, as a group of Bolshevik agitators took the prison where Tito was and freed the inmates. After escaping, Tito settles in Petrograd, thanks to the help of a Polish and Bolshevik friend. That Leninist Bolshevik shortly before seizing power, but he was arrested again and sent to a labor camp, although he manages to escape by jumping off the train that was taking him to prison. When he manages to get on a new train, it was stopped by a group of Bolsheviks who explained to the passengers that Vladimir Lenin had taken power in Petrograd and they were looking for recruits for an international Red Guard. It is then when Tito joins this component and spends the winter of 1917 to 1918 serving the Bolsheviks guarding strategic areas of the region. During that period, at 27 years old, he meets who would be his first wife, Pegahija Belusuba, a 15-year-old girl. That marriage would soon serve Tito to clean his reputation as a communist in his native region and to be able to return to his village. He finally returns to Croatia and learns of his mother's death and that his father had moved to the outskirts of Zagreb. When Tito returns to Croatia at the end of the war, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy in which he had been raised all his life no longer existed. It had dissolved after its surrender in the First World War in 1918, when it is forced to accept the division of its territory into new nation-states, giving rise to the states of Austria, the Kingdom of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Free State of Fiume, and the Kingdom of the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. With the Kingdom of the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, a unified South Slavic nation, which would be renamed Yugoslavia, a unified South Slavic nation that would be renamed Yugoslavia. It should be mentioned that the activity of the communists in this kingdom was quite notorious. They aspired to political positions and were recognized as the third political force of the kingdom. Tensions led to the prohibition in the new constitution of the Kingdom of the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs in 1920 of all communist activity in the region. In the first 10 years of Yugoslavia as a parliamentary monarchy, there were 25 cabinet changes, which accounted for the strong instability of this newly formed political community. It was in this environment that Tito had to navigate when he returned to his homeland. Thanks to his Eternal Metal Workers card, he manages to get a job in a Croatian village where he works for 4.5 years. Meanwhile, he approaches the country's communist circles and does activism with them. During this period, Tito also has 3 children, although 2 of them die at an early age. Bored with the same old dynamics, Tito decides to start a new stage in his life and organizes his own union in Zagreb, the heart of Croatia. Thanks to his charisma and his ability to relate, in a short time he becomes a full-time union leader of the Zagreb metalworkers and an active member of the Communist Party and its Croatian Regional Committee. The Comintern, or Communist International, created by the Soviets, saw Yugoslavia as a small strategic empire that needed to be conquered. Therefore, at first the Soviets supported the internal factions that sought to divide Yugoslavia into smaller states, thus making them weaker against Russian influence. But the Yugoslav communists were always very reluctant to this separatism of what for them was the longed-for nation of the South Slavs. In this breeding ground, a sort of left-wing Yugoslav patriotism begins to emerge in which Tito felt very comfortable. In those years of activism, Tito organizes a general strike for all of Yugoslavia and ends up arrested. Tito goes on a hunger strike, and in 1928 a court in Zagreb sentences him to 5 years in prison for communist agitation. With these events and prominent men within the Communist Party in Yugoslavia, even though he was not yet its leader, it doesn't take long for the leaders of the Comintern to notice that communist unionist who also knew how to speak Russian and German well. It is in prison where Josip Broz begins to call himself Tito, a name that he would later say meant absolutely nothing. From the 30s, the Communist International moves away from its separatist policy in Yugoslavia because it begins to perceive Yugoslavia as a containment wall for Italian fascism and German National Socialism that were emerging strongly. By March of 1934, Tito is released from prison, but when he returns to the street, the political situation he finds was very different. In 1929, King Alexander II of Yugoslavia had grown tired of the instability of the constitutional monarchy, so he dissolved the parliament, banned all parties, and set up his year in which the country's name officially became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Tito and many communist leaders in what is now the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Tito and many communist leaders find it unsustainable to stay in the country, so they decide to leave for Russia, financed by the Communist International. In Moscow, Tito begins to work directly with the Comintern on the situation in Yugoslavia. By 1937, many of the Yugoslav communist leaders who were in Russia were imprisoned in Stalin's purges. However, Tito manages to save himself and sees a chance to better his situation. In Moscow, he learns military techniques with the Red Army, attends the Bolshoi Theater, and briefly sees Joseph Stalin from a distance. In Moscow, Tito will learn the value of geopolitics and political operators. Also impatient with the methods and procedures of the Communist International, Tito sets up a network of his own informants who would provide information to Moscow according to his convenience. While Tito portrayed himself as the reliable figure in front of the Russians, his clandestine initiatives reinforced his autonomous political position. By 1937, after earning his place, a new milestone arrives when the Communist International names Tito as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. So by 1939, Tito returns to Yugoslavia as the leader of the Communist Party with the seal of approval from Moscow. However, this was a party that in Yugoslavia was dismantled and almost extinct. Tito had the task of rebuilding it from the ground up. And in this task, he knew little that new dramatic events were about to explode all over Europe and then in the world, a storm that would help Tito to conquer power. In 1939, England and France declare war on Germany, and what is known as the Second World War breaks out. During the next 2 years, Tito manages to rebuild the Communist Party to about 12,000 members, although the party was divided into Croatian factions, Macedonian factions, and Serbian factions. By 1941, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was about to join the Tripartite Pact, which had formally established the military alliance of the Axis powers between Germany, Italy, and Japan. However, 2 days before the signing of this pact, in March of 1941, officers supported by the British stage a coup in Yugoslavia to prevent the country's formal adherence to the Axis powers. In response, the German National Socialist government decides to launch a blitzkrieg in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941. In 11 days, Yugoslavia had already been conquered, and with the support of some Yugoslav sectors such as the Croatian nationalists, known as the Ustasha, Yugoslavia would be divided into several administrations in the hands of the Axis. In response to this, Tito and the communists, in general, are among the first and most fierce organizers of the resistance. Against the Axis forces, the Communist Party appoints a military committee led by Tito. He calls all Yugoslav people to arms and goes to the mountains to form an army. Without the support of any power yet, Tito begins to raise troops and is then appointed by the Communist Party as commander of the People's Liberation Army, which, in addition to expelling German, Italian, and Hungarian troops on Yugoslav soil, had the mission of neutralizing the internal Yugoslav factions that were enemies of the communist partisans. Tito, who already had experience, effectively manages to articulate a guerrilla war. During the war, Tito was always very well dressed and shaved, especially on battle days, with 21 buttons, impeccable and in good shape, to manage to gather many non-communists for the war. Under the flag of regaining national sovereignty, the communists set up women's organizations and youth organizations that continue to strengthen their social base. The other face of the Yugoslav resistance against the invasion were the so-called Chetniks, Yugoslav monarchists, who, in addition to wanting to expel foreign troops, opposed Tito's partisans, who on several occasions the Chetniks allied with the invading German and Italian troops to fight the partisans. 1942 is the most critical year of the war for Tito, as he was cornered by the German-Italian forces and the Yugoslav Chetniks. Tito used to throw himself into the heat of battle, and several even claimed that he put himself at too much risk. After a series of confrontations and military maneuvers, the partisan troops managed to recover some territories from the Germans and other Axis collaborators and start reclaiming new Yugoslav lands. But by January of 1943, the National Socialists launch an offensive against Tito with the help of Italians, Ustasha Croats, and some Chetniks. It would be a tough fight against the partisans who must resist this onslaught. The partisans win against the German offensive. From this milestone is that Josip Broz Tito becomes the great figure of resistance in the Balkans and mandatory interlocutor of the Allied side. That same year, even with much of the country in the hands of the enemy, Tito proclaims a provisional government of Yugoslavia and lays the groundwork for a future post-war government. In turn, Tito took advantage of summary trials to also get rid of internal enemies. Depending on who you ask, tens of thousands of Yugoslavs died for opposing Tito during the war. In turn, amidst this war chaos, several massacres occurred among Yugoslavs due to internal political and social differences within that heterogeneous group of cultures that made up Yugoslavia. The war situation was tough, and Tito needed what they wouldn't give him. The British, who were also looking for what they wouldn't give him. The British, who were also looking to gain influence in Yugoslavia, took advantage of this void and began to directly assist Tito. It wasn't until 1944, seeing that they were losing their influence in Yugoslavia, that the Soviets finally also sent military support to Tito. This relationship of Yugoslavia between Moscow and the West would be skillfully managed and exploited by Tito for many decades. A first sign of this is that the Yugoslav Anti-Fascist Council, in the early years of the war, held its meetings with portraits of Stalin, Lenin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. While Tito continues to achieve new victories and recover territories taken by the Germans, the government in exile of Yugoslavia shows weakness in front of Tito as the genuine leader of Yugoslavia. Churchill personally requests a meeting with Tito that ends up taking place in Italy in 1944. After that meeting, Tito goes to Moscow in secret, and Churchill is furious when he finds out the news. Tito responded by saying, "Well, Mr. Churchill went to Canada and he didn't tell me anything, and I don't feel the need to inform him because he doesn't need to inform me. On the other hand, the landing in Normandy and the American offensive changes everything, and after the advance of the Allies through Europe, the German forces are forced to neglect the region of Yugoslavia." Tito takes the opportunity to order an attack on Belgrade, the capital of the kingdom. The Yugoslav communists take the city on April 20th, 1944, and a year later Tito approves the temporary entry of Soviet troops who helped the partisans to finish expelling the Axis troops that same year. Finally, Yugoslavia had expelled the invader. The partisans gained fame as a liberating army, and Tito as a national war hero. He was the man of the moment in Yugoslavia and presided over the victory celebrations. After the victory, a coalition government was formed in Yugoslavia, as agreed before the war, led by Tito but with members of various political tendencies. However, between the summer and that of 1945, Tito took care of purging the government of moderates, liberals, and non-communists, and also takes control of public powers. In November of 1945, elections are held in which the form of government will also be defined, and Tito wins by an overwhelming majority. His opponents say it was due to fraud, and his supporters say that with his reputation as the liberator of Yugoslavia, which he had at that time, it was a result more than expected. The Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia is proclaimed, and that same month the Assembly officially deposes the King of Yugoslavia, Peter II, ending what was left of the monarchy in Yugoslavia. Thus begins the famous government of Josip Broz Tito. These are the post-war years in which control of the regions was divided between Americans and Russians. Many expected Tito to be a natural ally of the Soviet bloc and another satellite of the powerful Stalin, but the story would be different. Tito would take up the banner of socialism, but also the banner of nationalism and the sovereign patriotism of the peoples. The internal unity of Yugoslavia and foreign policy would be the priority in a multi-ethnic state that was in the sights of American and Soviet control. Tito was able to mitigate the rivalries that existed between internal ethnic political groups in Yugoslavia by unifying them in the face of the harassing threat of the capitalist and Soviet blocs. He consolidates himself as the man capable of forging the new independent Yugoslavia and protecting his nation in the historical longing for Yugoslav unification from the Anglo-Saxon and Soviet claws. Yugoslavia was socialist, yes, but its own type of socialism did not align with either of these two blocs. So after the elections, one of Tito's first tasks is to internally consolidate the new government. He dedicates himself to organizing the Yugoslav People's Army, which became the fourth strongest army in Europe at that time. And Tito takes charge of consolidating a police and intelligence apparatus firmly under his command. Likewise, Tito sets up courts that conduct trials and summary executions of those who collaborated with the National Socialist regime and several of those who opposed Tito, including politicians, Catholic priests, adverse figures, and some of his former collaborators as well, whom he now distrusted. This, which was partly inspired by the purges that Tito witnessed in Moscow, even irritated his Soviet counterparts, as Tito had even put several double agents that the Russians had in Yugoslavia to spy on him to death. Despite the initial disputes with the Catholic Church, Tito during the 60s was achieving several arrangements with the Church that resulted in Yugoslavia being one of the most religious countries within the Eastern Bloc, allowing freedom for the Catholic Church, the teaching of catechism in open seminaries, and for other religions. The Orthodox communists opposed the religious opening, and Tito confronted them. We will talk more about Tito's very unique economy of Yugoslavia later. The truth is that after strengthening internally after the war, Tito was now preparing to deal with external powers. And it is in this geopolitical game of the Cold War that Yugoslavia knew how to play a striking and original role. Tito promoted a discourse in the world that affirmed the principle of self-determination of peoples and peaceful coexistence. Under this vision, he promoted a policy of neutrality and cooperation with all countries, as long as these countries did not interfere in Yugoslav politics. The autonomy that Tito had gained during the war and his rebellious character led to the first conflicts of Yugoslavia with both the Western side and Stalin in the early post-war years. Stalin was annoyed that Tito supported the communist side of the Greek Civil War and that he held small but risky confrontations with troops from the Allied side during the post-war border rearrangement years. Tito also opposes Stalin's request to incorporate Bulgaria, dominated by the Soviets, into the Yugoslav Republic, so that same year in 1948, Stalin begins new maneuvers to gain control of the Yugoslav leadership, but simply does not succeed, as Marshal Tito, among other things, had a firm control over the military and police. So Stalin, unable to control the South Slavs and seeing them as a threat, opts to conduct a harsh and continuous public campaign against them, expel the Yugoslav Communist Party from the International Communist Order, impose an economic blockade on Yugoslavia, and concentrate troops in bordering countries. Rebellious Tito intensifies his sovereign stance, so by 1948, under the vision of building a strong but as independent as possible economy, Tito launches an economic program for the country separately and differently from the Soviet Union's economic program, which adds a new displeasure for Stalin and an escalation of tensions. He is the first and only socialist president to directly challenge Stalin while he was alive. Part of this economic program involved a harsh collectivization of lands, but under his own modality and what was called the model of worker self-management. For 1950 and the following years, Tito doubles down on the bet of economic self-determination, and the National Assembly of Yugoslavia approves what would be the basis of the distinctive type of socialism that would govern Yugoslavia. This would be the fundamental law on self-management, written by Tito and his main intellectual advisors. This self-management model discarded the Soviet-style centralized planning for a model of worker self-management, a seductive idea that sought to give control of the companies to the workers and give more power to the regions, not tying them to centralism. The main means of production would be state-managed under this modality, while other areas would maintain the presence of the private sector without neglecting the construction of a sort of extensive welfare state to attend to the primary needs of the population, with Yugoslavia, for example, enjoying for several decades a public education system very well regarded in Europe. After the 60s and after the 70s, Tito would push for new economic reforms that gave greater autonomy to private enterprise, while the state continued to have a directing role. The early post-war years, like the rest of Europe, were of scarcity and precariousness in Yugoslavia, but gradually the nation was economically rising and avoiding new crises. Between 1952 and the end of the 1970s, the average gross domestic product growth in Yugoslavia was around 6%. That is more than in the Soviet Union and more than in Western European countries. But returning to the numerous tensions between Tito and Stalin in the 50s, the conflict between them reaches such a level that Stalin allegedly organizes 22 failed attempts to end the life of Josip Tito, to the point that Tito would have sent him a letter threatening Stalin that he would send his own hitman. In the end, Stalin would die in 1956, and Tito would continue to rule Yugoslavia for many more years. Regarding his relationship with the West, Tito's Yugoslavia and the Western and American European bloc maintained mutual distrust, but Tito manages to get a first partial aid within the framework of the Marshall Plan. There were also various moments of tension with the United States and with Western Europe, since in exchange for the financial aids they gave to Yugoslavia, these asked Tito to Western powers for different reasons. However, Tito refuses to Western powers for different reasons. However, Tito refuses to. Over the decades, he was allowing greater spaces for the press, expression, the arts, and politics. But on his side, Tito would continue to be re-elected in successive presidential elections while he was the supreme leader and decision-maker of politics in Yugoslavia. Now, beyond these small diplomatic conflicts, Yugoslavia's relations with the United States and Western European nations were cordial. In turn, Yugoslavia's key role in the Cold War allows Tito to ask for a large amount of money borrowed from Western banking and international monetary organizations to finance his internal projects and his grand plans for works throughout Yugoslavia. Tito's government invests in new technologies coming from the West and in an industrial military apparatus coming from the Soviet Union. The loans from the West had the desired effect on Yugoslav life in the short and medium term. However, those same loans and their growing interest and conditions were one of the causes of the strong financial debacle that Yugoslavia would have after Tito's death. On the other hand, unlike the rest of the Soviet Union, Tito allows Yugoslavs to travel to Europe, exchange currency, and give freedoms to science, art, and culture. The truth is that Yugoslavia's geographical position allowed it to serve as a kind of filter between these two apparently opposing blocs, as the Yugoslav government signed its own personality to congregate countries that did not want to fully commit their autonomy. When Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of Russia, visits Yugoslavia in May of 1955 and even apologizes to Tito and approaches the leadership of that country with a conciliatory rhetoric. He manages to alleviate tensions between the two countries. However, Tito insists that Yugoslavia would not join the Warsaw Pact of the Soviets, arguing that the external threat from both blocs would remain present and mutating. In different ways, Tito maintains a strong and unified state, even constituting militias of men and women whom he armed and trained to prepare them in case of an invasion that never came in 1956 and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1956 and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 as examples that if the strong Yugoslav state separated and weakened, that would be the trigger for the Soviets to invade the Yugoslav or the police and the army. No one challenged them, and Tito controlled the police, the army, the intelligence, and counterintelligence apparatuses. Despite the fact that with Khrushchev there begins to be a de-escalation of animosity between the Soviets and the Yugoslavs, Tito on his part proposes to carry out an unprecedented international initiative, the formation of the Non-Aligned Countries movement. This movement sought the preservation of national independences without tying themselves to the two superpowers of the moment, and for the first time strongly promoting the idea of peaceful coexistence. So Tito begins to align himself with important figures like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Nehru of India in 1956, and starts to organize various meetings around the planet with countries that would bet on the same thing. The Yugoslav socialist self-management model and Tito's sovereign vision ended up being a manual for other countries for the policy of non-alignment. Over the years, the athletic and slender partisan had gained weight. He also went from being an absent father to a very present grandfather for his grandchildren and very attentive to his family. Now past 70 years old, Tito lives in a large house on a small estate full of objects, art, and memories, yet he remains the head of state. Despite Tito's strong leadership, Yugoslavia remained a nation of contradictions. By 1970, the so-called Croatian Spring occurs. Revolts in Yugoslavia, Tito completely suppresses the protests. However, in less than a year, Tito would approve a new constitution that incorporated many of the demands that these Croatian protesters had made. By 1971, after being re-elected president of Yugoslavia for the sixth time, Tito presents 20 radical constitutional amendments aimed at giving greater autonomy to the provinces, such as the creation of a collective presidency, an organism of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia, plus 2 autonomous provinces, namely Kosovo and Vojvodina. Tito had no shortage of enemies inside and outside of Yugoslavia, but even in his advanced age, they could not take away his leadership of the country after his youth marked by union activity, leisure reading war and prison, and after his government marked by nationalist pragmatism and the policy of non-alignment, with him as the great leader of the Balkans. Tito died in power on May 4th of 1980. Representatives from 122 countries attended his funeral. He was honored and bid farewell as the last great living leader of the Second World War from the Allied side, on par with Roosevelt, Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek, and Stalin, the creator of modern Yugoslavia, the leader whose cunning had unified the historically antagonistic groups of the Balkan region into a stable federation, a leader who, despite the pressures of both hegemonic blocs, did not abandon his at the head. However, after his death, Yugoslavia was left without a leader. Yugoslavia was headed for its downfall. The country enters an inflationary whirlwind, the economy sinks, and a financial collapse is unleashed. Ethnic and separatist divisions are stoked, and finally the Federation in the 90s dissolves amid bloody wars, the known Yugoslav Wars. In the end, Yugoslav integration always depended on the presence of the strong man. Without his presence, the disintegrating forces were unleashed. The project that took Tito's entire life effort would last very little after his departure. Tito knew that Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes would hardly be integrated into a national state, nor would they accept a hegemony of anyone over another. However, Tito sought and managed to harmonize it by all means possible. He did not hesitate to use violence when he had to, but he also knew how to use diplomacy and persuasion very well. He was not exempt from contradictions, shadows, and mistakes. However, his state work finds few parallels in the times of the Cold War. War hero in Europe who raised Yugoslavia against the invaders, father of a particular type of socialism that kept the republic protected from Soviet interventionism and Anglo-Saxon interference. Astute negotiator with the West and leader of the 20th century sovereign movements, Tito dies as the undisputed leader of a republic that some in the Balkans still remember with nostalgia. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. And don't forget that it is very important for us that you can subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video, follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and above all, that you collaborate with us on our Patreon with any help you can give us. Thank you all very much, and God bless.